So good afternoon. My name is Evan Weiner, and I'm going to be talking about events of 106 years ago. Now you may think, that was 106 years ago. Didn't impact me. How many of you had relatives who were in World War I? World War I.
I was in Poland
You were in
until
Poland.
1936.
So your parents
Yes,
were involved
they
in
were.
World War I. So World War I would eventually lead to the rise of Adolf Hitler, and we're going to go through that and how that all happened. But World War I rages on in 1918. Woodrow Wilson tries to end the war or give a roadmap to ending the war with his 14 points. The Doughboys, they went over there. The United States military was segregated. However, these guys, the Harlem Hellfighters, were some of the best fighters that were in World War I. Babe Ruth, patriotism, and the World Series all come together as one. How many of you remember Armistice Day? There's no more Armistice Day. No more. Hasn't been around.
Remembrance Day.
November 11th, it became Veterans Day, but Armistice Day comes out of World War I. The Spanish flu, which was not from Spain, takes over. I'm going to read this to you from over here because you can't read it on the computer. Step closer to prohibition. Prohibition Amendment. Congress has recently submitted an amendment to the federal Constitution providing for nationwide prohibition. It has already been ratified by several states. I recommend its early ratification by this body. As this is already a prohibition state and the plan is popular and working out well, I hope it will receive a unanimous vote in both houses. So
Who said
America, that was a politician way back when saying that we need to go dry. We don't need alcohol. How many of you could live without alcohol in your life?
I have been living without alcohol in my life.
Okay, there you go. There you go. Fight for women's rights and the right to vote continues in 1918. Tsar Nicholas II is killed. And you probably, every one of you in here would probably love to own that stamp. That stamp has the inverted Jenny. A Jenny was an airplane back then, a biplane, and it was struck upside down. Only 100 of those exist. Very, very valuable stamp to this day. How many of you like Tarzan? You like Tarzan? Did you see the first movie? It came out in 1918, called Tarzan of the Apes. And Tarzan has endured since it first appeared in book form in 1912. Edward Rice Burroughs created Tarzan for the book.
The actor
We'll get into that later. Now, mamas, don't let your sons grow up to be the Archduke of Austria and Hungary. It's not a job that provides much security, like Maximilian back in the 1860s, who was the Emperor of Mexico and was caught and, well, they killed him. And this guy, Archduke Ferdinand, and it's his assassination that kicks off World War I. Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He and his wife are assassinated by a gunman during a drive through Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. Sarajevo, of course, would be part of another war about 80 years later when Yugoslavia broke up. Ferdinand ignored warnings that Serbian terrorist group, the Black Hand, still upset from Austrians' annexation in 1908, was plotting to assassinate him during his state visit to Sarajevo. June 28th, the day of his tour, was the Serbian National Day. Franz is nagged by his wife, Sophie. Listen, Franz, let's go to Sarajevo another time. We don't have to go today. We could go see it another time because, something might happen and what's going to happen to the kids and our estate. So, hey, why don't we not go? We don't have to go. And Franz says, what could happen? What could possibly go wrong? He gets assassinated, as does Sophie. The assassination was traced to this Serbian extremist group that wanted to increase Serbian power in the Balkans by breaking up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. World War I was also known as the Great War. Starts on July 28, 1914. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and the tenuous peace between Europe's great powers quickly collapsed. Within a week, Russia, Belgium, France, Great Britain, and Serbia had lined up against the Austria-Hungarian Empire and Germany, and World War I, known as the Great War, begins. The Austro-Hungarian Empire attacked Serbia in response. Germany supported Austria-Hungary, while Russia sided with its traditional ally, Serbia. America's watching.
Oh,
It's Woodrow Wilson.
Wilson.
You don't like him, right?
I like him.
You like him. You probably won't by the time I'm done with this talk.
He's a beautiful, handsome man.
Yeah, oh, okay, well, physically, okay. Actually, he was a frail, sickly man.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, we'll talk about that another day. At the outbreak of the fighting, the United States remained on the sidelines of World War I, adopting a policy of neutrality, favored by Wilson, while continuing to engage in commerce and shipping with European countries on both sides of the conflict. On August 4th, Wilson declared that the United States would remain impartial in thought as well as in action. Too much money to be made by trading with the European countries. But in 1915, that starts to change with the sinking of the Lusitania. A woman, I gave this talk last week, and a woman who was born in Ireland said, hey, they knocked off that ship off the Irish coast. 1915, Germany declared war, or declared the waters surrounding the British Isles, Ireland was part of it at that time, as a war zone. And German U-boats sunk several commercial and passenger vessels, including some U.S. ships. Widespread protest over the sinking of the U-boat of the British ocean liner Lusitania, traveling from New York to Liverpool. That was their route, New York to Liverpool, Liverpool back to New York, Liverpool, England. Hundreds of American passengers were on board on May 7th, 1915, and that helped turn the tide of American public opinion against Germany. Also, this ship, the SS Arabic, is torpedoed. Germany declared war on tankers, on liners. August 19, 1915, a German submarine sunk the British ocean liner and declared self-defense. The event further strained diplomatic relations between the United States and Germany. Wilson warned Germany that if it was determined they sunk the ship without cause, the United States may cut diplomatic ties and enter the war. Germany caved, and in September announced they would no longer sink passenger ships without warning. Satisfied, at least for the moment, Wilson chose not to declare war on Germany, despite being encouraged otherwise by some of his cabinet members. And Theodore Roosevelt was out there and questioned Wilson's backbone. Theodore Roosevelt wanted to go to war, and of course he was probably thinking about running for president in 1916. Meanwhile, the war continues, and it devolves into a stalemate. The War on the Western Front. How many of you watched All Quiet on the Western Front, the movie?
That was a long time
A long time ago, but you saw it. That was my father-in-law's favorite movie, All Quiet on the Western Front. Anyway, the war had become one of attrition by 1917. The French army was exhausted. They bore the brunt of the Allied effort and the trauma of Verdun. The British were beginning to suffer manpower shortages, having increasingly taken over from the French in 1917. Americans wouldn't really hit the ground until November of 1917. The German army was weakened, despite being able to concentrate entirely on the Western Front after its defeat of Russia. Its manpower was rapidly diminishing, and its ally, Austria-Hungary, was crumbling. This changes everything. If you looked at it, it's a bunch of numbers. That's all it is. 15099, 9110, 10482, 97566, a bunch of numbers. You would never know what that is about. is called the Zimmerman telegram, and it's sent by Western Union. So the Germans were so confident with their code that nobody could break their code, they sent it by Western Union to their ambassador to Mexico. January 1917, British intelligence intercepted a telegram from the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German minister to Mexico, Heinrich von Eckhardt. The Zimmermann telegram stated that Germany planned to return to unrestricted submarine warfare and would sink all ships, including those carrying American passengers, located in the war zone. Now, Wilson had a fight with his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, back in 1915. Bryan said, you can't have this policy of sending ships into a war zone because something is going to happen. That was before the Lusitania. Wilson ignored them. Bryan decided he was going to leave public office, Secretary of State at that time. But he was right. The telegram also proposed an alliance between Germany and Mexico should the United States decide to join the European allies. Among the things that the Germans proposed to the Mexicans, we'll go to war with the United States, you help us out, you get back all that territory that you lost in the Mexican War in 1848, territory of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, pieces of Colorado, pieces of Oklahoma. All goes back to Mexico. Mexico lost 55% of its land back in the 1840s, and Germany said, we'll get all that land back for you. On April 6, 1917, Congress voted to declare a war on Germany. Wilson asked Congress for a war to end all wars that would make the world safe for democracy. And the Americans have gone to war, and there is Woodrow Wilson sticking his hand into whatever he's sticking his hand into and pulling out a number, and that was the draft lottery. I believe the number 254 was the first one pulled. On May 18, 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which authorized the federal government to temporarily expand the military through conscription. The act eventually required all men between the ages of 21 and 45 to register for military service. Under the act, approximately 24 million men registered for the draft. Of the total number of troops sent to Europe, 2.8 million had been drafted and 2 million had volunteered. The doughboy. And we're not talking about the Pillsbury doughboy here. We're talking about the Americans that went over the doughboy. The doughboy was a popular nickname for the American infantrymen during World War I. The Great War marked, and it was called the Great War at that time, marked the first time in history that the United States sent soldiers abroad to defend foreign soil. The French enthusiastically welcomed the first wave of soldiers. Viva la America! Now you go to Central Park and you see this little monument. It's in memory of John Murray Mitchell, mayor of New York City, 1914 to 1918. Born July 19, 1879, died in the service of the United States, July 6, 1918. Everybody, that's me, yeah.
That's it.
Everybody able male under the age of 45 was asked to go to war. And this guy was 38 years old, and he was the mayor of New York City. Had no benefit. He had to go to war, and he was killed. Yanks, Sammies, Pershing's Crusaders, some of the names to label American enlisted men in World War I. All Pershing's Crusaders and Sammies, short for Uncle Sam's Troops, made some appearances in advertising and propaganda posters, but most of those labels were not well liked by the troops, many of whom preferred to just be called Yanks. And the New York Yankees were not even very good at that time. They were better. More than 4 million American men, along with support from non-military personnel, were needed for the war. By September 17, 1917, Americans were on the battlefield. And how many of you know this song, Over There?
Over here, over there. Say a prayer for the man over there. The Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are
coming, and drumming everywhere.
I feel like Mitch Miller. I should be conducting you.
Say a prayer.
Words and music by George M. Cohan. He wrote over there after he learned that the U.S. abandoned their policy of non-interventionism and planned to enter World War I on the side of the Allies. Over there, well, that was probably the greatest wartime propaganda song, and was made famous by the singer Nora Bayes, who also popularized two other songs back in 1908. One was called Shine On Harvest Moon, which she wrote with her husband Jack Norwood, and the other one is played every day between February and November. You probably know it, Take Me Out to the Ball Game.
Yeah.
Of the three, that's the one that's everlasting. There are other songs. Oh, how I hate to get up in the morning. Irving Berlin. Also, some of the other songs. Don't Send My Darling Boy Away. There was the anti-German Bing Bang Bingham on the Rhine. Other songs depict the everyday lives of soldiers, like Irving Berlin's Oh, How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning, and I Don't Want to Get Well, a duet sung by Arthur Fields and Grace Woods. And there were colored soldiers. Now, the United States military was segregated, but there were colored soldiers, and that's a song, The Colored Soldier Boys of Uncle Sam, We're Coming, words and music by W.J. Nickerson, dedicated to the colored soldiers of the USA. African Americans who participated in every military conflict since the inception of the United States enlisted and prepared for involvement. However, many of those who enlisted or were drafted found themselves in non-combative support roles. Many African Americans served under the Services of Supply section of the American Expeditionary Forces. This section comprised of stevedore, labor, engineers, service battalions, and companies. The main function of these companies was to support and provide materials to other companies up on the front. The notable exception, the soldiers who fought on the front lines in the 92nd and 93rd Infantry Divisions. The 369th Colored Soldiers Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters. They were assigned to the French Army in April. In this post, the Hellfighters saw much action, fighting in the Second Battle of Marne, as well as the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. For his valiant and brave actions during World War I, Private Henry Johnson of the 369th became the first American to receive the War Cross from France. 170 other members of the 369th were also awarded the French Medal. Sedation Act. Woodrow Wilson wasn't very big on the Constitution. Took the right to free speech away from people with the Espionage Act in 1917. Emma Goldman. Do you know who Emma Goldman was? Well, she was an anarchist. She was a person who pushed for women's rights. She spoke out against the war in 1917 and was arrested. Well, Wilson and his Attorney General Palmer decided the Espionage Act isn't enough. We need something else. So they came up with the Sedation Bill. The Sedation Bill has been signed, one of the most dramatic measures ever enacted to catch and punish enemy agents. A 20-year penalty, $10,000 fine for obstructing liberty, loan, campaigning or recruiting. On May 16th, the United States Congress passes the Sedation Act. Along with the Espionage Act of the previous year, Sedation Act, largely orchestrated by the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer. He was the AG under Woodrow Wilson. The Espionage Act, passed shortly after the U.S. entrance into the war in early 1917, made it a crime for any person to convey information intended to interfere with the U.S. Armed Forces, prosecution of the war effort, and to promote the success of the country's enemies. Aimed at socialists, pacifists, and other anti-war activists, the Sedation Act imposed harsh penalties on anyone found guilty of making false statements that interfered with the prosecution of war insulting or abusing the U.S. government, flag, constitution, or military, agitating against the production of necessary war materials, or advocating, teaching, or defending any of these acts. And here's an ad from back there, or a cartoon from back there. Don't talk. The web is spun for you with invisible threads. Keep out of it. Help destroy it. Stop, think, ask yourself if you were about to say might help the enemy. Spies are listening, and they were serious. Those who are found guilty of such acts, the act stated, shall be punished by a fine of no more than $10,000, which would be $209,000 today, or imprisonment for not more than 20 years, or both. This was the same penalty that had been imposed for the acts of espionage in earlier legislation. Many of you have heard of this guy, Eugene V. Debs.
I heard of it, but
You've
I
heard
didn't
of
know
him.
what he looked like.
Well, that's what he looked like. Actually, he is prisoner number 9653. 9653. Eugene V. Debs was an interesting character. He was a socialist. Ran for president in 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912. And he is giving a speech in Columbus, Ohio. One of the most famous prosecutions under the Sedition Act during World War I was that of Eugene V. Debs, pacifist, labor organizer, founder of the Industrial Workers of the World, and he was a socialist. After delivering a speech on June 16, 1918, in Canton, Ohio, Debs was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 10 years in prison under the Sedition Act. But that didn't stop him from running for president in 1920.
Really?
Didn't stop him. Just because you're in a jail cell, it doesn't mean you can't run for president of the United States. And he had a little fun with that too, and I'll tell you about that more a bit later. But if you're arrested and convicted before a jury, sent to jail, you can run for president of the United States. Nobody is stopping you. Nobody. Sports took a back seat. That's Hank Gowdy. He was a catcher with the Boston Braves, or this baseball card which says catcher Boston Nationals. And he's the first guy to enlist in World War I from Major League Baseball. In the United States, most professional sports teams shut down due to World War I. Baseball didn't. Athletic men were needed for the war effort. Work or fight orders compelled professional athletes to join the military. Public opinion turned against athletes who chose to stay in the United States and play ball rather than join their fellow countrymen in combat. One of those athletes who did not serve was a guy by the name of Jack Dempsey. Did you ever hear of him?
Yeah.
The boxer? He said he had to support his family. And he became a controversial figure because he never went over there. On June 1st, 1917, the Braves catcher Hank Gowdy was the first Major League Baseball player to enlist in the United States military. Baseball was non-essential. Sports was non-essential. The Army General Enoch Crowder convinced Newton Baker, the U.S. Secretary of War at the time, that any eligible draft or draft-eligible men employed in non-essential jobs should be forced to choose, either enlist stateside or risk going to the front lines of Europe. That didn't stop the Wilson propaganda campaign. It didn't stop them at all. Baseball was the sport in America. Okay, yeah, there was some boxing and there was some horse racing. Basketball had barely been invented. Hockey was a sport played in Canada. Soccer was a European thing. It wasn't an American thing. Baseball was it, the big sport. So Uncle Sam dresses up as a baseball player, and the caption of this one is, "Get into the game." Wilson formed this thing called the Committee on Public Information to promote patriotism, except it was a propaganda prop. But there was one song that would come out of this. It was a song called the Star-Spangled Banner. And it was performed as early as 1897 at the opening day ceremonies in Philadelphia, the baseball game. And then more regularly at the Polo Grounds in New York City, beginning in 1898 at New York Giants baseball games. Any New York Giants fans here? Used to be. How many Dodger fans are here? 1, 2. You're always outnumbered. You're always outnumbered. When I ask how many Giant fans, maybe 0, maybe 1, how many Dodger fans, the hands go up. The hands go up. Anyway, the Giants were around before the Dodgers. Dodgers had a nickname once of the Bridegrooms, because a lot of their players got married, so they called them the Bridegrooms. It's a terrible name for a baseball team. Anyway, professional baseball came under scrutiny when both the American and National League decided against suspending the 1918 seasons. In 1918, during the World Series between the Boston Red Sox and the Chicago Cubs in Chicago, and it was held early than normal in September because the work or fight order was out there, and the National League owner said, you know what, we better cut this out or we're going to get in big trouble. But the Star-Spangled Banner would make a debut during the World Series. That is the flag that Francis Scott Key saw in Maryland in 1814 after General Richard Ross in August of 1814 sacked Washington, D.C. and headed up to Baltimore, where he encountered something at Fort William McKendree. The flag was still there after a heavy bombardment. And Francis Scott Key sat down and wrote this little ditty, which was paired with this old beer hall tune, which became the national anthem in 1931, but it wasn't at that point the national anthem. A military band was on hand for Game 1 of the World Series in Chicago, and during the 7th inning stretch that Thursday evening, it played an impromptu rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner. It was a patriotic song, and the Star-Spangled Banner took off after that, and within 13 years, it would be the national anthem. Babe Ruth emerges as a baseball star in 1918. 23-year-old Babe Ruth. He won 2 games in the World Series as a pitcher, but he became both a pitcher and an everyday player during the season. Boston won the World Series, defeating the Chicago Cubs 4-2. Ruth split time between the outfield and the mound for the first time in his career. He had 13 wins. He was a really good pitcher. He won something like 88 games during his career before going full-time to the outfield. And he led the league with 11 home runs in 1918. I got a question for you. How many of you like playing around with your clocks, pushing your clock back in the fall and pushing it ahead in the spring? You don't like it. How come you don't like it? You don't like it. You don't like doing it.
No, I don't, because you forget.
You forget. Well, you could blame World War I for this. You could blame World War I. Spring forward, fall back. That's the Mutual Bank in 1983 in Boston. That's long gone. The Standard Time Act of 1918, also called the Calder Act, established standard time in the United States to be divided into 5 time zones. The East Coast, the Midwest, the Rocky Mountains, Pacific, and Alaska and Hawaii. It was created by the Interstate Commerce Commission in concurrence with zones previously established by the National Railroad System. It also dictated that on the last Sunday of March each year, the clock be advanced 1 hour and then returned on the last Sunday of October of the same year to save fuel. You had to know this for your SATs. It's Wilson's 14 points. And it's 14 points to end World War I. Goes before Congress in January. It says, if we do this, I think we can end World War I. Open diplomacy without secret treaties. Economic free trade on the seas during war and peace. Equal trade conditions. Decrease armaments among all nations. Adjust colonial claims. Evacuation of all Central Powers from Russia. Allow it to define its own independence. They were communist. Belgium to be evacuated and restored. And they talked about Montenegro. That's Kodar, Montenegro, where me and my wife were on a cruise ship that I was speaking on. That's Kotor, which is actually an interesting place because you sail into Montenegro and it's an old glacier And it's absolutely gorgeous sailing into there and sailing out of there. Return of the Alsace-Lorraine region and all French territories. Readjust Italian borders. Austria-Hungary to be provided an opportunity for self-determination. Redraw the borders of the Balkan region, creating Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro. Creation of a Turkish state with guaranteed free trade in the Dardanelles. Creation of an independent Polish state. That would have affected your parents. And creation of the League of Nations. Kaiserschlacht. That's it, Kaiserschlacht. This is going to be the last battle. We're going to win this battle for the Kaiser. We're going to put all the chips on the table, and we're going to go after the Allies. At the beginning of 1918, as winter ended, the German army decided to launch a major offensive with the goal of pushing the Allies back and winning the war. The German Spring Offensive, also known as Kaiserschlacht, or the Kaiser's Battle, was launched on March 21st. The German army made significant advances into France. However, despite this, they suffered heavy casualties. In fact, Adolf Hitler was wounded in one of these battles. The offensive stalled by July due to the lack of new soldiers and limited supplies from Germany. Second Battle of the Marne. On July 15th, near the Marne River in the Champagne region of France, the Germans began what would be their final offensive push of World War I. Dubbed the Second Battle of Marne, the conflict ended several days later, a major victory for the Allies. The Germans went after a front line that really wasn't a front line. They got through it, and then they met the real front line. They were met with fierce barrage of French and American fire. Trapped and surrounded, the Germans suffered heavy casualties. The Allies would counterattack, and that would launch on July 18th. It would be called the 100 Days Offensive. The Allies thought they could mop up Germany within 100 days. It's launched in August. The goal of the offensive, push back the Germans, retake control of the ground that had been lost earlier in the war. The Battle of the Hindenburg Line was fought between September 17th and October 15th. It's part of the 100 Days Offensive. The Hindenburg Line was one of the last defensive structures held by the German army. 3 waves of attack were required by the Allied forces to finally break through the defenses. Each wave relied upon heavy artillery bombardment, followed by infantry advances, supported by tanks and aircrafts. At the end of each wave, the Germans had suffered 4 times the casualties in comparison to the Allies. And this is the guy who's leading the German band, General Ludendorff. And he realizes it's over. And he's the guy who loses the war. And he may be the guy who created Adolf Hitler. Follow me on this one. In the fall, Germany and its allies were exhausted. The armies were defeated, and their hungry citizens began to rebel. As early as September 29th, the German general and strategist Erich Ludendorff decided, well, it's over. We got to get a peace treaty done. The German government approached the United States. They wanted an armistice. But the United States really wasn't in any mood to give them an armistice. Germany asks for peace on Wilson's 14 points. That 14-point speech that he gave in January, the Germans are finally listening about 9 months later. It gave birth to the Germans wanting to get out. But the Americans weren't listening. The Germans hoped that it would be based, whatever truce or treaty they got, on the 14 points that Wilson laid out as a foundation for peace without victory. By October, though, with their troops bloodied and engaged in the Western Front, the Americans said, get out of here. We're out. Gone. Goodbye. You're not getting it. Wilson wasn't going to do anything anyway. This guy, Ferdinand Foch, is the negotiator, and he is negotiating on behalf of the Allies. The armistice negotiations were conducted by the commander-in-chief in the field, Foch. He ensured that the conditions made it impossible for the German army to recommence fighting. This is what he said. We want the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II. We want a democratic government in Germany. And we really don't want you ever to have a military again. And yeah, you're going to be humiliated in the defeat, and you, Ludendorff, are going to be the one most humiliated. And he had to take it. Meanwhile, the other countries are beginning to stop fighting. The Armistice of Mondros. The Ottoman Empire, the Allies, signed the Armistice of Mondros on October 30th. The signing took place aboard the ship in the port of Mondros, the Greek island of Lemnos. Terms of the agreement included letting the Allies take control of the Straits of the Dardanelles and the Bosporus, and having the Ottoman Empire surrender control of all garrisons outside the Anatolia region of modern-day Turkey. This agreement really ends World War I, but there's no treaty. Germany, well, they want an armistice. And they say, okay, what do you want, Foch? And Foch says, this is what I want from you on November 11th. The armistice on November 11th, 1918, an armistice day, ending the land, sea, and air fighting in World War I between the Allied nations and Germany. Although previous armistices eliminated Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this armistice marked a victory for the Allies and a complete and utter rout of Germany. This was not a formal surrender. And this is Times Square, November 11th, 1918. And people are having a party. The war is over. However, what they didn't know was this was a breeding ground for influenza. Influenza. They didn't know that at the time. Didn't know it at all. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the war to end all wars ends with an armistice. But the war didn't end totally. Hostilities ceased, but treaties needed to be signed. The actual terms of the armistice were written by the Allies' Supreme Commander, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, and included the cessation of hostilities, the withdrawal of German forces to behind the Rhine, Allied occupation of the Rhineland and bridgeheads further east, and keeping infrastructure, surrender of aircraft and warships and military material, the release of Allied prisoners of war and interned civilians, and eventual reparations. There were no releases of any German prisoners, no relaxation of the naval blockades around Germany on November 11th, 1918. This was a horrible war, and this is a cartoon depicting men dying in the trenches. Total number of the military and civilian casualties in World War I, about 40 million people. There were about 20 million deaths, 21 million wounded. Total number of deaths included 9.7 million military personnel, 10 million civilians. The Allies lost about 5.7 million soldiers, while the Central Powers, Germany and its allies, lost about 4 million soldiers. Woodrow Wilson goes to Europe in December, and this is the New York Times headline. Paris gives Wilson welcome of unexempled warmth. He declares for the exemplary punishment of war makers, sees enduring peace only in a League of Nations. On December 13th, Wilson arrives in France to take part in World War I peace negotiations and to promote his plan for the League of Nations, an international organization for resolving conflicts between nations. The Spanish flu was deadlier than World War I. Spanish flu was deadlier. The flu emerged in two phases. In the late spring, the first phase, known as the three-day fever, appeared without warning. Few deaths were reported. Victims recovered after a few days. When the disease surfaced again in the fall, it was far more severe. Scientists, doctors, and health officials couldn't identify where the disease came from, why it was striking so fast and viciously, eluding treatment, defying control. Some victims died within a few hours of symptoms. Others died a few days later. Their lungs filled with fluid. They suffocated to death. Same thing happened with COVID. I had two great uncles who died during that time from the Spanish flu, which did not originate in Spain. Despite its name, researchers believe the Spanish flu most likely originated in the United States. One of the first recorded cases was March 11th, Fort Riley, Kansas. Overcrowding, unsanitary conditions created a fertile breeding ground for the virus. Within a week, 522 men had been admitted to the camp hospital suffering from severe influenza. By the way, that flu is still out there. It's been weakened, but that flu is still out there 106 years later, maybe more, maybe 107 years later. Spanish flu deadlier than World War I. There's somebody being taken away. Soon after, the Army reported similar outbreaks in Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, California. Navy ships docked at East Coast ports, and they also reported outbreaks of severe influenza and pneumonia among their crews. The flu seemed to target military personnel, not civilians. So the virus was largely overshadowed by hotter current affairs such as prohibition, the suffrage movement, and bloody battles in Europe. In the spring, it appeared that America's involvement in the fight against Germany was beginning to make a difference. In March, 84,000 doughboys were sent out to Europe. They were followed by another 118,000 in April. Little did they know, they were carrying with them a virus that would prove to be more deadly than the rifles they carried. While sailing across the Atlantic, the 15th U.S. Cavalry incurred 36 cases of influenza, 6 deaths. By May, the killer flu had established itself on 2 continents and was still growing, deadlier than World War I. The influenza of 1918 showed no bias in its approach to the combatants in World War I, as men from both sides were sickened and killed. Great Britain reported 31,000 influenza cases in June alone. The flu proved to be a leveler of men that war plans had to be altered. Attacks that had been painstakingly planned had to be postponed due to a shortage of healthy men. By early summer, the flu extended its reach beyond the U.S. and Western Europe. Numerous cases of influenza were reported in Russia, North Africa, India, the Pacific Ocean. Well, you weren't safe from the waters because it spread to parts of China, Japan, the Philippines, New Zealand. By the end of July, the influenza of 1918 left its mark globally. Tens of thousands fell ill and died. Deadlier than World War II. That is a theater, and that's somebody in front of the theater, and it says, all theaters closed until further notice, the mayor. Health experts couldn't exactly pinpoint where the virus first took hold. There were conflicting reports, which generally agreed that it spread through the World War I military troop movements. The pandemic was associated with Spain because they talked about it openly. They were not in any war. They didn't censor their news. Spanish news sources reported the results of the devastating disease that was sickening and killing people. The spread of the Spanish flu was slowed by identifying suspicious cases through surveillance and voluntary and/or enforced quarantine or isolation. No vaccines, no antivirals. And the public health official said the only thing that would prevent the spread of the flu was this, the mask. The mask. Does that sound familiar? Like from 4 years ago? The mask. Mask as protection. Look at the soldiers. And look what they have on. Masks. In the United States, local governments rolled out initiatives to try to stop its spread. These varied by regions, including closing schools, places of public amusement, enforcing no spitting ordinances, encouraging people to use handkerchiefs, or disposable tissues, and requiring people to wear these in public. And they got a backlash because people did not want to wear these in public. Mask ordinances mainly popped up in Western states, and it appears most people complied with them. The nation was still fighting in World War I, and officials framed anti-flu measures as a way to protect the troops from the deadly outbreak. By fall, 7 cities, San Francisco, Seattle, Oakland, Sacramento, Denver, Indianapolis, Pasadena, California, put mandatory mask rules in effect. San Francisco first began masking in October and ended in November after World War I ended. But there was something called mask slackers. And these are various newspaper headlines. Police raid saloons and war on influenza, keep church windows open. Flu curfew to sound for city Saturday night. Non-essential crowds barred in epidemic war. Those were the headlines. They remind you of headlines from 4 years ago? What goes around comes around. In San Francisco, the penalty for maskless violators was $5, $103 today. Or $10, $206 today. Or 10 days in prison. On November 9th, 1,000 people were arrested. The San Francisco Chronicle reported that city prisons swelled to standing room only. Police shifts and court sessions were added to manage. As bars, saloons, restaurants, theaters, and schools were closed, the masks became a scapegoat. Symbol of government overreach. Have you ever heard that before in the last 4 years? Government overreach, inspiring protesters, petitions, and defiant bare mask gatherings. All the while, thousands of Americans were dying in the deadly pandemic. 1970, I went to high school, and there was a book out called Nicholas and Alexandria at that time. There was also a movie of the same name, and I ignored it. Didn't have any interest in it. And here I am, 54 years later, talking to you about Tsar Nicholas II, who was killed in 1918. In November 1917, the Bolshevik revolutions, led by Vladimir Lenin, took over the government of Russia. Tsar Nicholas II tried to convince the British, then the French, give me asylum. You know who my wife is. You know who Alexandria is, don't you? She's the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Both countries refused, and the Romanovs found themselves in the hands of the newly formed revolutionary government. Both Nicholas and the Empress Alexandria were in denial. They thought they were going to be back on the throne eventually. They'll be saved. Instead, they were shuffled from house to house. Finally, they were imprisoned in the home that the Bolsheviks called the House of Special Purpose. What was that special purpose? July 17th, the Romanov family was awoken and told to get ready for another move. Still hoping to escape, the women packed their things, put on their clothes, and they had sewn jewelry, religious icons, and money into those clothes. They're on the move again. Then unexpectedly, their captors turned on them, attacking them first with bullets and then with the butts of guns, bayonets, and even their own heels and fists. In the end, all 7 Romanovs were dead, and the last gasp of the Russian monarchy were dead. Prohibition and Carrie Nation. There's a bar in Boston, right next to the State House, about 2 blocks down, called Carrie Nation, Boston's first speakeasy, named after this woman. Carried an axe into saloons and broke whiskey bottles. In 1826, the first of the temperance societies, American Temperance Society, formed. It had some success, but it wasn't until the proliferation of saloons after the Civil War that the temperance movement gained more traction. Prohibition proposal. These are women. They're ready to kill the bartender because the bartender gave their husbands liquor, and their husbands might come home and beat them up. 1873, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded, and the temperance movement got its most forceful voice. The history of the temperance movement and the women's movement were linked, which explains why the WCTU originally proposed the ban of alcohol as a method from abusing or abuse from alcoholic husbands. They'd come home and beat up their wives. The WCTU spent many years building the movement through education and local and state laws, and in 1881 they had big success. Kansas introduced a ban on alcohol in their state constitution. You want to mess with her? She's got a hatchet in her hand. I wouldn't go close. She's got a hatchet. It is at this time that Carrie Nation came to prominence by attacking saloons with a hatchet. However, saloons still maintain their popularity Even though their popularity was on the decline during the Progressive Era, which is generally thought to be 1890 to 1920, when the hostility towards saloons became widespread. The push for prohibition gained momentum, often with women and Protestant congregations leading the way. During World War I, there was a temporary prohibition on alcohol production. There was also a pronounced anti-German sentiment pushed by the Anti-Saloon League. And since many brewers were German and often the loudest opponents of prohibition, this temporary situation dealt a serious blow to the anti-prohibition forces. However, the support for alcohol, a ban on alcohol, continued. This was an ad. Close the saloons. If you believe that traffic in alcohol does more harm than good, help stop it. Strengthen America campaign. 22nd Street in New York was their headquarters, 165 East 22nd Street. On December 18, 1917, a constitutional amendment to prohibit alcohol was proposed in the Senate, and in October, Congress passed the Volstead Act, the National Prohibition Act, which was enabling legislation that set down the rules for enforcing the ban on alcohol and defined the types of alcohol alcoholic beverages to be prohibited. The ban goes out for a vote to the 48 states in 1918. Vote dry, vote dry. Prohibition movement wanted to rid American society of the tyranny of the drink. The act of drinking would be illegal, but it would not be illegal to make wine at home. Farmers grew fruit. They could retain the ability to produce hard cider and whiskey and wine, and they would be available for medicinal and religious purposes. Meanwhile, women are still third-class citizens in the United States. And this is the program that Alice Paul came up with on March 3rd, 1913, the eve of the Wilson inauguration in Washington, D.C. There's going to be a mass suffrage parade, and hundreds of women were beaten up during confrontations with police. That year, Alice Paul founded the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, which later became the National Women's Party. Alice Paul was a Quaker, born in New Jersey, very accomplished, eventually became a lawyer, which was unheard of in those days. Her organization staged numerous demonstrations and regularly picketed the White House, among other militant tactics. As a result of these actions, some group members were arrested and served jail time. Carrie Chapman Catt comes to the front as the woman who is heading the committee by 1918. And Wilson switched his stand on women's voting rights because he could get something done with Carrie Chapman Catt. Wilson also tied the proposed suffrage amendment to America's involvement in World War I and the increased role women played in the war efforts. When the amendment came up for a vote, Woodrow Wilson addressed the Senate in favor of women voting. As reported in the New York Times on October 1st, he said, "I regard the extension of suffrage to women as vitally essential to the successful prosecution of the great war of humanity in which we are engaged." Meanwhile, 1918, some women got the right to vote, but it came with strings. You had to be over the age of 30, you had to be married to somebody who owned property, or you had to own property. It was called the Representation of the People Act, and it was passed on February 6th. It was also known as the Fourth Reform Act, and expanded the voting rights for men as well. They didn't have to own property anymore. That tripled the size of the electorate in Britain from 7 million to 21 million. And women could run for political office in the UK. Women could run in the United States. Jeanette Rankin was elected to Congress from Wyoming in 1916 and voted against entry into World War I. She was a pacifist, but she wasn't arrested because she was a member of Congress. On November 21st, the Parliament Qualification of Women Act, 1918, and an act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom is passed. It gave all women over the age of 21, wait, they couldn't vote until they were 30, but if you were over 21, you could run for election as a member of the Parliament. In the December 14th election to the House of Commons, 17 women ran. The only woman elected was Shane Finn's candidate for Dublin St. Patrick's, Constance Markovitz. However, in line with the abolitionist policy, she decided not to take her seat. Remember airmail?
Well,
Everything goes by airmail now, including from here to where I live, which is 6 miles, probably goes by airmail. On May 15th, the United States officially established its airmail service with inaugural flights between Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia and New York City. Army planes and pilots were used on the first flights. 3 months later, the post office took over air mail operations with planes and civilian pilots of their own. Neither snow, nor fog, nor winds, nor torrential rains were expected to delay them in the swift compilation of their flights. This attitude did little to improve the image of the airmail service, which at the time was considered little more than the suicide club for flyers. Anybody collect stamps here?
oh, that's a good stamp.
That's a good stamp.
Yes,
That's a really good stamp.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good stamp. It's a
It's like it's
stamp
upside
that
down.
you want. It's a stamp that you want, but you're not going to get it.
Yeah.
You can't afford it, probably. Flying Jenny mistake. The inverted Jenny is a misprinted U.S. postage stamp showing an inverted image of a blue plane. The error occurred on the 24-cent, $5.37 today, airmail stamp. Only one sheet of 100 inverted stamps was sold. No other examples have been discovered. The inverted Jenny depicts a biplane, the Curtiss JN, known as the Jenny. But in part because of the rush to print the stamps, the plane was accidentally printed upside down. This is what the stamp was supposed to look like. One sheet of 100 of the misprinted stamps went public. The value, not immediately apparent. Some clerk bought it for face value, all 100, for 24 bucks. $537 today. Tarzan! Tarzan of the Apes. It's on film in 1918. Tarzan of the Apes is an action-adventure silent film directed by Scott Sidney, starring Elmo Lincoln. He's the guy who is Tarzan. Enid Markley, George B. French, and Gordon Griffin. It was the first Tarzan movie ever made, based on Edgar Rice Burroughs' original 1912 novel, Tarzan of the Apes. Tarzan of the Apes was the highest-grossing film in the United States in 1918, bringing in about $1.5 million. Today it would be $30 million.
Not bad.
The legacy. Well, that's Woodrow Wilson. It's with David Lloyd George and Orlando of Italy and Clemenceau of Paris, and they're the guy, or rather France, and they're the four that are going to carve up the spoils after World War I. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points never really took off. Wilson's idea for the League of Nations materialized, but the United States never joined the group, and the United States never signed off on the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. World War I would not end until 1923 with the Treaty of Versailles. The stab in the back and the creation of Hitler. And this is Ludendorff. And you got to follow me a little bit with this, but I'll get to it. It's like a Myron Cohen routine. Erich Ludendorff was among the many who portrayed Germany's new civilian government as responsible for the German defeat, not his leadership. Almost immediately, Ludendorff began to proclaim in speeches, books, and articles, myth of the stab in the back. He argued that Germany had not been militarily defeated, but somebody else sabotaged them. Liberals, communists, war profiteers, Jews. Jews fought for Germany in World War I. In his way, he sought to avoid his own responsibility for the defeat. One of those former soldiers who was listening was Adolf Hitler. Former German soldier from Austria named Adolf Hitler bought into Ludendorff's big lie, the big myth. Ludendorff was part of the 1923 beer hall push in Munich, where Hitler and the Nazis tried to overthrow the government of Germany. Hitler believed in Ludendorff. And Ludendorff wasn't forgotten. There was a movie in 2017 called Wonder Woman. You might have remembered that. And in that movie, Danny Hudson's villainous General Ludendorff was named after the German general Erich Ludendorff. You had to know a little bit about history if you're watching that movie to understand why the name Ludendorff was used. Armistice Day. That doesn't exist in America anymore. 1954, after World War II, required the greatest mobilization of soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen in the nation's history. After American forces had fought aggression in Korea, the 83rd Congress, at the urging of the Veteran Service Organizations, amended the Act of 1938 by striking out the word armistice and inserting in its place the word veterans. With the approval of the legislation, Public Law 380 on June 1st, 1954, November 11th became a day to honor all American veterans from all wars. Also Decoration Day. Remember that? Gone too. It's now Memorial Day, which is a week from Monday. Again, the Spanish flu. Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, 1919 was the deadliest pandemic in world history. 500 million people across the globe, 1/3 of the population got it. 50 million died. 675 million died in the United States alone. The time. That's Nevada time, right? The time. Nearly 2/3 of Americans said that they were in favor of ending clock changes, according to an economist YouGov poll of 1,000 adults in March 2023. Of those who favored the time change, half said that they would favor daylight savings time, which means in this area, in the winter, it would get light at 8:30 in the morning, but would get dark around 6 o'clock. But if you go into the western part of the time zone, and where it gets light at 6:30, that means it would get light at 7:30 and would get dark at 7 o'clock. But during the summer, in this particular area of the world, if you stayed on daylight time, rather on standard time, it would get light at 4:20 in the morning in the summer and get dark at 7:20 in the afternoon. Do you want that? Anyway, so half said they favored daylight savings time, while 31% said we'll stay on standard time. Federal law currently prevents states from unilaterally making daylight savings time permanent. However, 19 states have enacted legislation or passed resolutions to greenlight permanent daylight savings time if Congress approved the change, according to the National Conference of State Legislators. You can run for president from a jail cell. Eugene V. Debs, convict number 9653. And he's running for president in 1920 on the socialist ticket. And he's campaigning from a jail cell. You could run for president after being convicted by a jury and being sent away for some time for president. There is no law against it. There is no gagging order saying you can't do it. You could do it if you want to.
How many votes did he get?
I'm going to tell you in a second. November 2nd, 1920, Eugene V. Debs received more than 1 million votes in the U.S. presidential election on the Socialist Party ticket while in prison. He was serving that 10-year sentence for the speech in Canton, Ohio, protesting World War I, which was raging in Europe. He was arrested and convicted in federal court under the Espionage Act of 1917. Just before Christmas, 1921, President Warren G. Harding commuted the 10-year sentence of the socialist Debs with one condition. He had to go to the White House and have dinner with Warren G. Harding, who did not, Prohibition, what was that? So I'm sure they had a few drinks. The speakeasies. Prohibition, and most women, they had the right to vote starting in 1920 after constitutional amendments were passed. Prohibition was ended in 1933. Not all American women got the right to vote, in 1920. Native Americans weren't allowed to be United States citizens, so federal amendment didn't give them the right to vote. With the passage of the Snyder Act in 1924, American-born Native women, American women, gained the right to citizenship. But as late as 1962, individuals still prevented some women, individual states, some women from voting by the use of literacy tests, poll taxes. The poll tax was finally got rid of in 1964, in claims that residence on a reservation meant that one wasn't a resident of that state. Native-born Asian Americans already had citizenship in 1920, but the first generation of Asian Americans did not. Asian American immigrant women were excluded from voting until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 allowed them to gain citizenship 3 decades after the 19th Amendment. Women in England and Wales and Scotland received the vote on the same terms as men, age of 21, without property requirements in 1928. Over there, how I hate to get up in the morning. In 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt awarded George M. Cohan a special Medal of Honor for his contribution to the cause in World War I. Babe Ruth was traded to the New York Yankees in 1920. He became the greatest home run hitter of his time. Tarzan remains relevant in culture. There are movies, radio series, television shows, Tarzan video games, and comic books. Star Spangled Banner became the national anthem of the United States in 1931. Anybody want a stamp?
I just want to use a,
You want that stamp?
wait,
It's going to cost you quite a bit of money. On November 15th, 2023, the inverted flying Jenny stamp was put under the hammer by Robert A. Siegel Auction Galleries. The final price was a record for the stamp, $2,006,000. The buyer was a 76-year-old guy by the name of Charles Hack. He was a real estate developer and investor. He lost out in 2018, but he told the Washington Post this time he's willing to go higher for such a pristine stamp. This is the premium copy. It doesn't get any better than this. That 24-cent stamp, if you kept it and was in good condition, would only be worth about $5.40 today. But it was sold for more than $2 million. Your turn to talk. Any questions, any comments? Nobody? You're all satisfied?
I was fascinated that